Hey everybody, happy Monday. Welcome to another episode and another week of Learn with Flow. We've been able to really dive into this month of October and kind of like the fall transition, I feel like has really shown a lot of different colors for people, right? Not just like the physical colors of outside, but also have had a ton of really great conversations with individuals kind of going through some stuff, right? It's a season of change, it's a season of transition, which can kind of feel a little bit unsteady sometimes. It can feel a little bit unsettling sometimes, not only to our physical body, but also to our nervous system as well. And so I think that this has been the perfect time to have some good, kind of like mental conversations again, a little bit around even just the connection of the brain and the body. And specifically, we dove into this hierarchy theme that I want to call the month of October around our relationship with food. And there's so many different things that go into our relationship with food, obviously. And one of those things I think is not only, the quality of the food that we eat, but also even just regulating our overall appetite and hunger and fullness cues and learning really how to turn intuitive with that and know like how does this gonna feel for a healthy human metabolism, right? What does that look like to fuel myself adequately? So based off of a ton of conversations that I have with clients behind the scenes on a regular basis, I wanted to start our October off really talking about this theme of underfueling. And it's probably one of the, what I call kind of like silent sabotagers of most, especially my women, although I do have some men that struggle with this as well too. Around the board when it comes to just foundational metabolic health symptoms, hormonal imbalances, gut symptoms, you name it. A lot of it can be traced back and rooted to all around just our relationship with food and specifically some of those underfueling type patterns. So if you were with us last week, we dove all into this concept of undereating. What does it mean to undereat? What are some different scenarios in which some people undereat? And really, what are some of the significant ways that we kind of can recognize and again, kind of hear our body talking to us through daily symptoms of what might be some of those signs and symptoms that we are underfueling on a regular basis. So we really talked about difficulty losing body fat or kind of that like weight loss resistance struggle can be a sign and symptom of underfueling. Also feeling just like generally puffy and inflamed. That's something that I see and hear quite frequently, especially for my females that are chronically underfueling. Dealing with constipation, dealing with bloating, dealing with horrible digestive patterns can kind of lead us towards that underfueling type tendency, as well as struggling with low energy, chronic fatigue, sleep disturbances, menstrual cycle irregularities, infertility, inconsistent hunger or appetite, like feeling no hunger or appetite signals, or feeling like I'm always thinking about food and really fighting some strong craving urges. Not to mention all of the psychological and emotional connections that we talked about too. Difficulty concentrating, brain fog, social isolation, self-comparison, obsession over body image, obsession over what other people are consuming. All of those types of things really start to make us think about and question, could an underfueling pattern, or more accurately represented is an inconsistent fueling pattern at the root of how a lot of these symptoms are coming together. So this is where I really want you guys to start to think about a little bit, sometimes even high level, asking some of the questions that we normalize in our society today. So it's like, do we really need more caffeine? Or are you just under eating, right? Or sometimes I ask some of my ladies too, it's like, are you really struggling with mom brain or are you under eating? Do we really need more stimulants to try to focus our attention or concentrate, or are we under eating? Do we really need like sleep sedatives, or are we under eating, right? And so that's where I really want to kind of turn the conversation on its head a little bit, because I think that there's so many different symptoms out there that we're trying to kind of like run ourselves around in circles when we really haven't even covered this foundational question, or really answered this foundational question of, what are you eating on a daily basis? When are you eating on a daily basis? How much are you consuming on a daily basis? And really coming to terms with that first before we start thinking about all of these more nuanced answers to some of those symptoms, sometimes it lies in some of the most simple and foundational things that we either don't want to answer to because it makes us uncomfortable to talk about our relationship with food. It makes us uncomfortable to talk about our fueling patterns and our beliefs and our food rules that we're following. But a lot of times that's where the magic lies, right? That's where the healing comes from. So if we're not taking it back to that foundation first, it's really, really difficult to dig into anything even more complex to a lot of those symptoms. And that's where I think it's important to even have this same conversation, add that extra question that I want to take us in a direction of today, which is even on the opposite end of the spectrum of, do we have emotional eating tendencies or stress eating tendencies, or are we just under eating, right? Which I know is a very wild idea. It's like, Lauren, you really just contradicted yourself there when you talked about somebody that really labels and titles themselves as someone that struggles with stress eating, stress cravings, emotional eating. Some people call it binge eating or feeling out of control around food. And so they feel like, oh yeah, I am not in this under eating conversation. Like I am in an overeating conversation. So that's just not me. How can you ask that question, right? Or pose that question of, is some of my stress, emotional, or overeating tendencies as a result of undereating? And that's what I really want to dive into a little bit more today, because you would be surprised that a lot of times the answer is yes. There's a lot more tied there than you think. And we have to kind of take it back to just biology, right? And understanding how physiologically our body works to be able to even recognize that this could potentially be a connection, right? So taking back and kind of repeating a little bit of what we talked about last week, it's important to note that undereating can't happen at any body size, right? So it's not just this size inclusive thing of like, oh, if you're undereating, we would know it because you would look frail, you would look underweight, you would look like you had some disordered eating tendencies. And that is and can still very much be a very real and very classic picture of underfueling, right? Especially a chronic underfueling picture. But like last week, we really dove into the different kinds of underfueling, and some of it isn't necessarily intentional or purposeful restriction. Some of it can also be kind of like accidental or incidental undereating. And by doing that or following some of those patterns of more inconsistent eating, try underfueling your body for periods of time and expect it not to rebound into an overeating survival mode trigger. Absolutely. And for a lot of individuals that I've found, if we can iron out some of the inconsistencies and really dive into their belief around food, their belief into what a healthy meal actually looks like for them, and helping them understand how to fuel themselves consistently, all of a sudden a lot of the stress eating, emotional eating, binge eating patterns dissipate, right? So it's like, did we wear that label? Did we need some sort of appetite suppressant? Did I need a detox to help me curb my cravings? Or do I not need to meet my binge eating and stress eating and emotional eating with more restriction? Actually meet it with a better understanding of why those binge or stress or emotional eating triggers come up in the first place, right? So that's really what I want to dive into and talk about today, because I think that there's this really weird stigmatized like badge of honor, especially around diet culture and around women's health, where there's this like silent competition going on amongst women to see who can like survive on the lowest amount of calories possible without passing out, right? It's like, it's wild to me of like, who can restrict themselves the most, who's doing the craziest diet intervention, who's doing the most restrictive detox protocol or Whole30 or 75 hard. It's like, who can restrict and deprive themselves the most, yet so we like praise women everywhere for, starving their bodies intentionally or unintentionally or surviving on bare minimum. Yet we throw this like massive shame flag and embarrassment stigmas when we find out that someone has more of a binge eating type pattern or stress or emotional eating pattern, right? Ultimate level of more embarrassment, right? And it's like, but wait, it's like, how can we do that and like shame more of a instinctual response that the body is asking for fuel. The body feels in some way, shape, or form that there is a mismatch, an energetic mismatch between the amount of what's being asked of the body and the amount of what is being given to the body. There's a gap, and that gap then our brain takes over, our hunger hormones take over, our physiology actually changes to support a binge emotional stress eating trigger, right? That's where it's going to come from. So we can't just sit here and, like I said, praise one end of the spectrum and then shame the other end of the spectrum when the body reacts exactly how we would expect it to, right? And that's where I think a lot, I'm not saying that all, and we'll talk about this too as we dive in, but not all emotional eating or binge eating patterns are tied to underfueling or inconsistent fueling. That's not true. But I want to bring light to this population of individuals that are struggling with this picture because they kind of don't fit like a classic under eating picture, right? They're going to be the people where they see the title of my last video talking about like the silent dangers of under eating, and they know there are other people around them may not know, but they know they have emotional eating, stress eating, binge eating type tendencies. So they're not going to click on that video, right? They're not going to be like, oh yeah, I'm an under eater. It's like they wear the badge of like, I am an overeater, I'm a stress eater, I'm an emotional eater, I have binge problems, I'm addicted to sugar, right? It's like these really, really shameful, almost like scarlet letters that individuals wear because they know that in those moments where they feel out of control, and so they're going to gravitate more towards more restriction, which then furthers some of the emotional and binge eating tendencies. And they are those individuals that feel stuck between a rock and a hard place because nobody is speaking to that group. And this is me speaking to that group, right? I'm not saying that there's not some individuals out there that don't struggle with some overt binge eating tendencies, not as a result of underfueling, but there is a very large population of individuals that do feel out of control around food at times. And they know that about themselves and they're meeting themselves with more restriction. And this is me trying to find those people, shake them and say, hey, that's not going to work anymore. We need a new strategy, and we need to come to the table with a level of like understanding and compassion and knowledge of like where are those triggers coming from to begin with, and where might we come to the table and try to wipe the slate clean. Maybe those binge emotional eating labels don't actually really exist. They're more being produced by a chronic underfueling pattern, right? So that's where I'm really speaking into here. So that's where I want to kind of pose that question of, do you feel like you might be someone wearing that title of a stress eater, an emotional eater, a binge eater, but are you actually, or are you really just under eating, right? So emotional eating, just as a high level definition for us, is the tendency to overeat in response to negative emotions, feelings like stress, grief, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, shame, embarrassment, sadness, right? All of those like heavy negative feelings can then trigger more of a turn towards seeking comfort in that sense, right? And depending on how we were raised, childhood experiences, diet experiences, health history, some of us can really turn towards food as a sense of that like flood of dopamine, although temporary, it does in that moment give us kind of that flood of dopamine where we turn towards food to act as that comfort. And in that moment, then we kind of, ditch more of the long-term feelings of stress relief for stress relief in the moment. Does that binge actually lead to less stress? No, it leads to more stress because the individual then comes out the other side of that experience and like, why did I do that? I feel super shameful for it. And then they vow to restrict themselves going into the next day, right? And we all know how that happens, right? It's like you're going to white knuckle for so long before that same pattern is going to happen all over again because we're not addressing the root cause of it. So not all emotional eating is binge eating, right? But more often than not, I do hear a lot of patients describe their relationship with food as out of control, or around certain foods they have really like insatiable or really intense cravings, right? And so in reality, we have to recognize that our body is hardwired for survival, which means that there's an expectation for a certain amount of energy to meet our metabolic demands, right? And if that is not being met, we have way more energy being asked of us than energy being put into the system. That gap is going to be instinctually closed by survival mode, right? So for a lot of individuals, our body tries to like close that gap or forcefully close that gap by flooding the system with hunger hormones, decreasing our satiety hormones, creating blood sugar responses, creating stress responses, and the body really does then crave more of those things that provide high energy output, which is starch and sugar and fats. So in that moment, like nobody's craving vegetables, like in a binge, right? Because they're not energy dense. They're nutrient dense, but they're certainly not energy dense. So the body's not going to look at that and be like, yeah, that'll solve my problem. The body's going to look at a donut or chips or the crackers or the candy, or so it's like, that's going to solve my problem right there. That's high energy density and it can get into my cells like right now, right? So we have to recognize that certain amount of like energy out and energy in, anytime there's a gap, that's where we're going to have to really meet, like, how are we closing that gap? And for some individuals, their body closes that gap through stress, emotional, and some like binge eating type tendencies. So when we think about that energy demand though, it's not always just like energy out from like an exercise standpoint. It could be, but it could be things like we have to take all of it into consideration. Do you have a high stress job? That's energy demand. Do you have an active lifestyle or an active exercise routine? That's an energy demand. Do you have poor sleep and poor recovery? That's an energy demand on the body. Are you dealing with repressed emotions or repressed trauma or grief? Are you an anxious person? Are you a high achiever, type A perfectionist mentality? All of those things that I listed are a call for high energy demand. Whether you want to view it as energy demand or not, because I know that we think like, oh, well, I'm not out there running a marathon a day. It's like, no, but your body sure thinks that it is, based off of all of the energy output and not the same amount of energy being put in. So if those needs are not met, it will drive the urge to eat, specifically those energy dense foods, right? It's like your body's not going to crave things that aren't energy dense in more of an underfueled survival pattern. Right? So of course, in that moment, we're not going to be able to restrict ourselves and be like, oh, look, I just am not meeting my energy demands today. I think I'm going to grab an apple and some nut butter. It's like, very few of us are going to be able to do that, especially at the end of the day where energy is low, decision fatigue is at an all-time high, and that stress demand is like going to be closed now, especially since most of our environment tends to be surrounded by more of those energy dense foods as well too. So a combination of kind of your environment and your physiological demands at that point are going to make it very, very difficult to really like close those energy demands the way that they should be closed. So we end up feeling out of control around food. So to me, I'm sitting here looking at this and I'm like, okay, so instead of the same BS that we've just been going time and time again through all of these cycles of like restrict, deprive ourselves, and then white knuckle it and eventually give in and binge, and then we feel shameful about ourselves again. So here we're gonna restrict and deprive ourselves again through a different cycle. We're gonna white knuckle it through those cravings. Eventually we're gonna binge. It's like this cyclical pattern isn't working for anybody. And that's because we're meeting this feeling of feeling out of control and these urges and tendencies of overeating. We're trying to meet it with more restriction, right? And so by going through these failed approaches, we start to feel and internalize that we're broken, right? It's like, well, that sugar detox didn't work for me. I was back on sugar right on day 11, right after the 10-day sugar detox was done, right? It's like, so then we start to wear those labels of emotional eating and binge eating. And I start to say, let's address the root of the problem so that we can start to kind of ditch these labels and start to confidently take back control of hunger, fullness cues, and know what that looks like to adequately fuel our body so that we're not getting into these triggers of binge eating or emotional eating or stress eating type patterns, right? Because I think that's the other side of the coin that a lot of people try to do too. They either try to meet themselves with restriction, or they recognize that like, oh, I just need to reduce my stress. Okay, not a bad idea, but a lot of times like people are out there thinking that their only sources of stress are more like mental and emotional stressors. And so then it's, again, a futile cycle, because let's be honest, it ain't going away. Stressors are not going away in life. It's not about reducing your stressors to reduce your emotional eating or your stress eating, because more stressors are just going to come. So I'm not saying that like having tactics and tools to be able to better understand our stress load and be able to manage the stress load, yes, but more so than anything, we need to understand what that stress load is and meet the metabolic demands of our body accordingly to start to blunt that response or buffer that response, right? If you try to wait and you're like, oh, I'll just deal with my stress or emotional eating, like when my stressors are lower, it's like, good luck, right? It's like stress is just gonna keep coming. So the sooner that we recognize that and put some better strategies in place, now all of a sudden we're not dealing with these big restrict binge type tendencies, right? So there are a few patterns here that I want to kind of leave you guys with today that really start to talk into where do these patterns of binge eating come from? And once we know where they come from, then we also in our back pocket have strategies to be able to correct them, right? So when we think about the patterns that contribute to binge eating, I really separated it kind of into 5 main patterns here. Number 1, lack of consistent meal timing. Probably one of the most like simple ones, right, on paper, but for individuals, a lot of this can then be chalked up to how their day is scheduled or overscheduled, lack of planning on their part to actually like time block, I don't know, meals, right? Just like they time block meetings or appointments, and it's like, heaven forbid, we time block like when we're going to fuel ourselves. So in the modern world, especially for women, I see a ton of this, like I said, hustle and grind culture. There is no like shortage of women putting other people's needs before their own, even when it comes to the simple meals throughout their day, right? So I think you see a lot of lack of consistency in meal timing, especially when it comes to breakfast these days. People trying to pull off and they're like, oh, I grabbed a protein bar for breakfast, or I had coffee for breakfast, or I had a yogurt for breakfast. I'm like, that's cute, like that's a snack, but that is not a meal, right? And so if we're having stress, emotional, binge eating tendencies at the end of the day, we got to look there first, right? It's like that's going to be step 1, day 1, all day long. So we can't necessarily just think about like, what we're eating, but we also have to think about when we're eating, or the glorified grind of working through lunch, skipping lunch, or like I mentioned last week, like standing at the kitchen island and eating our meal versus actually sitting with our family and enjoying it, because we're always just like multitasking, always moving. So skipping meals or going light on meals and trying to like save your calories for later is a classic example of this too, because the body does not work that way. And so one of the probably biggest tools and strategies that I help women with that are dealing with more of these stress and emotional eating tendencies is making sure that they are not thinking of this as like a full day, right? Your body doesn't think like a full day. We think our body thinks like a full day, but it does not, right? So when we think about it, it's like, I can't just like, save my calories from breakfast and give them to dinner because I know I'm going to have a binge later. So I want to save my calories. It's like, what you're doing is literally triggering your own binge. You're your own sabotager right now when you do that. It's like, don't do that. And it's like, I know it's hard to like not trust yourself at first, but it's like you start to allocate more of the energy towards the beginning of the day. And all of a sudden you're like, I didn't have a binge last night and my cravings actually felt good and more controlled. I'm like, wow, winning, right? We actually played to how our body works versus how we want our body to work, right? It's like work with it not against it, and it tends to work so much better. So under eating throughout the day is probably one of the quickest ways to have more of that stress, emotional, and binge eating tendencies is under fueling throughout the day. So consistent meal timing is a big one. Number 2 that can trigger more of these binge or emotional eating patterns is going to be lack of dietary balance. So was just talking about this with a gal this morning too. Sometimes under fueling isn't always just like sheer number of calories that we're under fueling, but our body can also be under fueled when it comes to certain micro or macronutrients. So it can drive binge emotional eating tendencies if there's certain macronutrients that are being restricted. So I see this pretty frequently, especially with individuals that are on pretty restrictive diets, like they've been low carb for a long time, like they go keto or they go carnivore, or they've been on like pretty restrictive diets for like vegan or plant-based. We know that with diet culture, there's no shortage of different diets that promote like more restriction. And the more restriction means that that's a tendency of something that we're going to feel deprived of and binge later. There's also that physiological response where our body's like, hey, I'm missing on carbs, and it's gonna like really ramp up the cravings for more carbs because that's what it wants. That's what it feels like it's missing. So I'd say another example that I shared with a client before, she came to me really saying, I just remember this sentence vividly for some reason, where she's like, I have intense sugar cravings. I feel very out of control around sugar. And she's like, to the point that like periodically, usually like once a month, I need to do like a 10-day sugar detox. I'm like, how's that working for you? And she's like, well, good, I think so. I was like, so you have to repeat the 10-day sugar detox like every month? I go, what happens between the sugar detox? And she's like, oh, I binge on sugar so bad. I'm like, so is that really working for us, right? Sometimes we have to have that person to really kind of put the mirror in front of our face and be like, oh yeah, that's not working, is it? That's really just a Band-Aid solution that then is fueling some of my like binges and some of those cravings even more so later. It's like, what if we just like gave our body what it wanted from the jump? I'm not saying like binge on sugar, but obviously our body is feeling carbohydrate depleted. So why don't we just navigate that more smart? So we can think about like how lack of dietary balance leads to nutrient depletion, leads to mental restriction, mental deprivation, and all of that is then going to fuel more of that emotional stress and binge eating type patterns. Number 3 is going to be unmanaged stress. Yes, I said it. Now, this isn't like reducing your stress. I'm talking about managing your stress. And managing your stress is really just a fancy way of saying your reaction, your response, your coping mechanisms to life stress that are outside of food. Some people do. This is just a skill and a practice that they need to discover, and they need to go through the proper steps to discover what are their things that they turn to besides food, because as we already recognized, yes, like succumbing to that urge to overeat or that urge to binge in the moment, does it feel like it might release your stress? Yes. In the long term, does it? No, it just adds to more stress because now you feel stressed that you binged, and now you feel like you need to restrict even more the next day, which then fuels a future binge, and here we go round and round again, right? So the unmanaged stress piece and making sure that we do have some coping mechanisms that are outside of utilizing food as a coping mechanism. Number 4 is going to be mindlessness when it comes to eating. This is a big one that can contribute to binge eating tendencies and not even know it. Really cool studies actually coming out too around like the use of technology and hunger, cravings, and fullness. So they actually did a really cool study. I'll have to get the exact like credentials and title of the study for you guys, but having individuals eat while viewing blue light, like on a screen, scrolling on a phone, eating while watching TV, eating while doing computer work, consumed 30 to 60% more calories per sitting than an individual eating undistracted. That's wild, right? And so there's lots of different, even really cool studies looking at just the effect of like blue light on our hunger and satiety hormones. Spoiler alert, results don't look so good, right? So we know that just our inundation with technology and blue screens and all of these things are messing with hunger fullness cues and hunger fullness signals. Not to mention they just take us out of the eating experience. So we're eating on autopilot, we're chewing, we're swallowing, but we're not connected with that eating experience. And so our brain isn't even really registering that we're eating because our brain is focused on like the task or the screen at hand and not at all connected with the sensory overload of eating, right? So really trying to slow down and practice what I call your good food hygiene habits, eating without screens, eating without phones, eating seated, taking nasal breaths before eating, to connect yourself to like, how does your food smell? Also recognizing like, how does my food taste? Oh, it tastes sweet. It tastes salty. What is the texture of your food? Oh, it's crunchy. It's soft. It's warm. It's cold, right? All of those types of things of like seeing the food, smelling the food, tasting the food, recognizing the texture, that is going to really join that brain body experience. And you tend to then again, are more connected with natural hunger fullness cues with that as well too. And the final one that triggers overeating quite a bit, especially in my more like type A achievers, active athletes, is going to be overexercising. And this is one that can be a little bit tricky because a lot of times people think like, oh, I exercise to earn my food, right? When in reality, none of us are really probably out there, and this is speaking outside of like my high level intentional athletes, right? Which are a whole different ballgame. But most of us out there are just trying to like look good, feel good, right? We probably hit the gym maybe multiple times a week or an hour a day, right? And because of that, we think like, oh yeah, I did a workout this morning, which makes me like earn my food. It's like, well, it doesn't necessarily, like I said, work that way. Your overall energy expenditure from your workout probably isn't like absurdly through the roof, right? So a lot of times what I see though, especially individuals that are dealing with some hormonal imbalances already, like low testosterone, blood sugar dysregulation, high cortisol or adrenal dysregulation, low progesterone, wonky menstrual cycles, trouble sleeping, like your stress bucket is already full, already high. So we're adding on top of it like high intensity exercise. I want to go out and do CrossFit. I want to do Peloton. I want to do Orange Theory. And we're out there just trying to like ram ourselves like full tilt towards a wall, not recognizing that our stress bucket's like already full. And then on the opposite end of that, not only does that like create a lot of stress, that extra stress also ramps up your appetite. So I only say that because I see quite a bit with individuals that aren't managing their overall energy in and energy out. Sometimes some of that high intensity exercise can overflow your stress bucket. And instead of actually making you fitter, it does tend to make some people fatter because they don't regulate or they can't regulate the amount of hunger that comes from their energy load there, if that makes sense. So again, I usually see that more frequently with like those high intensity sport. And those are individuals that come and tell me, they're like, I cannot get full, right? And it's like, they're constantly thinking about food. They're constantly hungry. They tend to snack more. And that's just because their like hunger fullness hormones like leptin and ghrelin are all sorts of off. Their brain is just registering like eat because that stress bucket is overflowed, but they don't necessarily like need that caloric intake. They need more to regulate the hormonal side of things and regulate the trigger of what's contributing to that overall overfueling type tendency, right? Or that binge eating type tendency. So I would really watch that because again, sometimes those inappropriate exercise routines for someone's body can contribute to something called leptin or insulin resistance. And those do tend to then come along with an increased appetite, right? So hopefully, like I said, thinking about the 5 main patterns that contribute to some of this binge and emotional eating, inconsistent eating patterns, restrictive eating patterns or like lack of dietary balance, unmanaged stress, mindlessness, over-exercising. Now all of a sudden we have this whole toolbox to start to think about like, oh, So that's how I'm going to start to tackle really this badge that I've been wearing as an emotional eater, as a stress eater. Like, my way out of this isn't necessarily more restriction. I don't need another detox. I don't need appetite suppressants, because those things are really just like masking the issue at hand. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So I just want anyone out there that's kind of recognizing maybe more of those like over fueling struggles, that any of these scenarios of intentional or unintentional under eating can lead to patterns of overeating very quickly. And we normalize some of those behaviors. Some people even call them like, oh, that's my cheat meal, that's my cheat day. And then we like shame other times where we say it's like lack of willpower or binge eating, right? So we shouldn't be shaming a body that's obviously like under-fueled and under-resourced for doing exactly what we would expect it to do. Not enough energy, not the right type of energy, can quickly develop into what appears to be an emotional or a binge eating type pattern. So if you've never really thought about it that way, that would be the start of what I would start to kind of consider, instead of just going down the same rigmarole that you've tried 15 times, like more restriction, just a different way of looking at more restriction, a different diet, right? Last week we talked about like putting a lipstick on a pig. It's like, it's still restriction, right? You're trying to do the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results, instead of coming to the table and trying something completely new that actually works with your body, not against it. So if this sounds like you, like I said, whether it's the intentional, unintentional underfueling leading to some binge eating, stress eating, emotional eating patterns, you would be a great candidate for my Master Your Metabolism Masterclass. It is a 6-week self-paced course that I have posted on Renew University. There are tons of resources within that course. There's grocery guides, meal planning tools. There's 6 weeks worth of modules recorded by me talking about how to eat in a way that manages blood sugar balance, how to formulate your day around what we call circadian meal timing for maximum satiety, how to make sure that we're managing hunger and working in those types of favorite foods on a consistent basis, but put them in the space and the place that they're supposed to be, so that you can enjoy things without deprivation or restriction, but also see and feel success towards your goals. So if that feels something, like I said, that's in line for you, that is my Master Your Metabolism course is going to be nutritional foundations at its finest. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200 until you have the nutrition foundations in place first, because a lot of times some of the symptoms that we're experiencing, hormonal symptoms, gut symptoms, all of those things really do trace back to that really, really strong foundation. And you can't really get too much farther into the weeds until you have those foundations first. So head over to Renew University, courses.renewuniversity.com to check out my Master Your Metabolism course. You can also find that under the link in my bio. So happy hunting with my Master Your Metabolism course. I'm excited to see some of you guys registering for that and getting started. I'll always reach out to you, like I said, when you get registered, and make sure that you're off to the races with that. So enjoy the rest of your Monday, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys for more Learn with Flo next week.